This video will provide you with the knowledge of Jane Austen's life and the world she was living in. It will also signpost some of the important elements of her writing. This knowledge will allow you to have a richer understanding of Austen's novels when you read them. So why should we read the novels of a woman who lived 200 years ago? Well, I think the first reason is because Jane Austen created amazing characters. I think she's right up there with Shakespeare and with Dickens for how realistic her characters were. They were neither just good nor bad, they were a mixture, and that made them real. Next is the themes. Jane Austen wrote about themes that are still relevant today, about the role of women in society, about wealth, about the haves and the have-nots. And finally, because Jane Austen novels are funny, she looked at these and explored these very important themes, and she did it all through humour. Now, look, not everyone loves Jane Austen. I certainly do, and there are people who do, but there are also people who don't. And we're going to have a look at some of those criticisms of Jane Austen's writing now. The realism and lifelikeness of Miss Austen's characters come nearest to those of Shakespeare. That was by Alfred, Lord Tennyson. Jane Austen had a talent for describing the involvements and the feelings of characters of ordinary life. The exquisite touch, which renders ordinary commonplace things and characters interesting from the truth of the description, and the sentiment is denied to me. What a pity such a gifted creature died so early. Sir Walter Scott. Now, there were also people who didn't like Jane Austen, and you can imagine some of these comments being written on social media today. I'm at a loss to understand why people hold Miss Austen's novels at so high a rate, which seem to me vulgar in tone, sterile in artistic convention, imprisoned in their wretched conventions of English society, without wit, genius, or knowledge of the world. Ralph Waldo Emerson. And my favourite, every time I read Pride and Prejudice, I want to dig her up and beat her over the skull with her own shinbone. Mark Twain. Now here's a little segment I like to call Chalk and Talk. Jane Austen wrote about what she knew, so to understand her novels, it's really important to understand her life. She was part of a really close-knit family, and often, obviously, families were an essential part of her novels, who were on the lower fringes of the landed gentry, which was the middle class, and again, what she wrote about. Jane was the seventh of 8 children. She had 6 brothers and 1 sister, Cassandra, who was Jane's best friend. Her formal education finished when she was 11 because her father could not afford to pay for her schooling. And in 1796, Jane fell in love with Thomas Lefroy. It is believed that his family discouraged him from proposing to Jane because of her family's lack of financial means. And Lefroy is often considered to be the person who she based some of her romantic heroes in her novels, such as Mr. Darcy. In 1802, Austen received her only known marriage proposal. This proposal came from the wonderfully named Harris Bigwither, who was the brother of Jane's friends Alethea and Catherine. Jane initially accepted the proposal, but the next day told Harris that she couldn't marry him because she didn't love him, and then her and Cassandra got out of the house very quickly. Jane never married. Despite her success as a novelist, she was forced to rely on her brothers to provide her with money that allowed her to live. Jane Austen novels are romance novels, but they also really accurately showed the restrictions that were placed on women at the time. Now, the inheritance law was one of these restrictions. It was pretty simple. In the 18th and 19th century, the oldest son, or closest male kinsman, inherited everything. The younger sons of landed gentry would generally join the clergy or the military or study law. In contrast, women had less choices. Generally, the common option was to marry. However, an unmarried woman might continue to live with her parents, which is what Jane did, or go to another family as a lady's companion or governess. And these restrictions are really clearly shown in Jane Austen's novels. So in the 18th and 19th century, there were rigid expectations of how males and females, the landed gentry, should behave, and they were the people that Austen was writing about. Women were socially and economically dependent on men, and Austen satirised the social conventions of the time in her novels. And look, it's important to understand when reading Austen's novels what satire is. And satire is the use of humour, irony, exaggeration or ridicule to expose and criticise people or society's stupidity or vices. Jane Austen lived in a time where there was a lot happening historically. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars. Now, a criticism that's been levelled of Jane Austen's writing is that these major events play a very minimal role. And that's something I want you to think about. Why do you think these political, military, and economic events play such a minimal role in Austen's novels? And there are other people who argue that no, they're definitely there in Jane Austen's novels. So have a think about that. Jane Austen wrote 6 novels, and I think the below is a pretty good summary of the 6 novels. Austen's plots, though fundamentally comic, highlight the dependence of women on marriage to secure social standing and economic security. And here are the heroines and the books that they're related to. Catherine Moore, who's the heroine in Northanger Abbey, Elizabeth Bennet, Pride and Prejudice, Fanny Price, Mansfield Park, Anne Elliot, Persuasion, Eleanor Dashwood, Sense and Sensibility, and Emma Woodhouse in Emma. So now let's look at some elements of Jane Austen's style. Jane Austen is credited with transforming the novel as her plots focused on the everyday and the unremarkable. The gift of Austen's writing is her realism, which is skillfully achieved through her combination of narration, dialogue, and characterization. Now, characterization, great thing to write about in essays, so let's have a look at that definition. It's the concept of creating characters for a narrative. These characters may be presented through their actions, speech, thoughts, interactions with other characters, or through the narrator's editorial comments. Jane Austen is credited with transforming the novel. Novel writers of her age were kind of writing these elaborate plots. They're almost like soapies, these ridiculous things happening all the time. Now, her narrative style is referred to as free, indirect speech, which again is another great thing to write about in essays. In this style, the narrator periodically adopts the voice of one or more of her characters. And look, it's generally one, it's generally the heroine. This technique allows the reader access to a character's inner thoughts, and it provides an objective appraisal of the experience. And we'll look at that a little bit further on. So with Jane Austen's narrator, it's an omniscient perspective. However, which means that it knows everything, but occasionally this perspective is sometimes limited. It's opinionated. Look, it's usually the heroine's voice to help the reader to really empathise with the heroine, and it's judgmental. So there's enough distance from the heroine for the narrative voice to be ironic and also judgmental. We've got this wonderful quote, "Irony is the soul of Jane Austen's comedy." And look, it's hard to imagine writing an essay about Jane Austen and not talking about irony. So, what is it? Irony is a subtly humorous perception of inconsistency, in which an apparently straightforward statement or event is undermined by its context so as to give it a very different significance. In verbal irony, it involves a discrepancy between what is said and what is really meant. Structural irony in literature involves the use of a naive or deluded hero or unreliable narrator whose view of the world differs widely from the true circumstances recognised by the author and readers. So, what were Jane Austen's themes? So, what is a theme? Again, great thing to write about in your essay. A theme is an idea that recurs or pervades a work of art or literature. Austen's novels centre on the education of women in the years leading up to their marriage. Within this narrow dramatic scope, she worked with broad social themes, and they're what we're going to look at now. Of course, every Jane Austen is about love and romance, but it's love and romance that is tied to money and property. Jane also looks at the individual and society. She looks at morality. And also appearance versus reality. One of the worst things that you can be in a Jane Austen novel is be hypocritical. So Jane Austen novels were all about women. But one of the questions that is commonly asked is, was Jane Austen a feminist? And I want you to think about it as you're reading the novels. Firstly, it could be argued that Jane Austen was not a feminist because courtship and love drive the conflicts in her novels. And at the end of each of the novels, the heroine gets married, which endorses the established social order. However, it could also be argued that Austen's novels are feminist, as they expose the fact that marriage for the landed gentry was an economic institution. Austen's heroines were also intelligent and independent. So as you read the novels, think about that. Where do you stand? It makes for an interesting essay. So what were some of the key points? Let's recap. Jane Austen heroines were middle-class women who transformed on their journey towards marriage. The restrictions placed upon women of this class are highlighted in Austen's novels. Austen uses irony in her novels to humorously expose societal flaws. Marriage is a marketplace, and Austen transformed the novel genre through her use of realism and development of characters. So look, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and watch out for our next video, which will be coming very soon. Thanks again for watching.